Hello and welcome to the GPEDC monitoring webinar on indicators 1, 5, 6, and 9B. My name is Anna Whitson and I'm joined here in New York by my colleagues Liz Chung and Yuko Suzuki from the UNDP side of the Global Partnership Joint Support Team. And you're seeing on the video screen our colleagues from the OECD side of the Joint Support Team, Nathan and Alejandro, who are also joined by our colleague Sibele. So today we're going to cover indicators 1, 5, 6, and 9B in a session lasting hopefully about 90 minutes, but we've budgeted up to 2 hours. So we'll have short presentations from our colleagues here, followed by plenty of time for an interactive question and answer session. So just a few quick housekeeping items before we start. To cut down on the feedback noise, we've muted all participants. So if you have a question at any time, please feel free to hit the raise hand button and we can unmute you. Or feel free to type your question out in the question box on the toolbar. We'll also be recording this session and making it available to download early next week after the conclusion of the webinar series. So at that time, we'll also circulate all PowerPoints used in the series, as well as a link to all monitoring documents, which are housed on our Global Partnership community space, unteamworks.org/GPEDC. Also, if you'd like a copy of today's presentation before this time, please note that it's available to download via the handouts link that's there on your toolbar. So I think with that, we'll just quickly hand over to our colleague Alejandro in Paris, who you're seeing on the screen, to begin the presentation with a bit of background.
Thank you, Anna. I would like to start with a 5-minute overview. What is a global partnership monitoring framework? What is this monitoring roundabout? What are we covering, and what are the indicators, the set of 10 indicators that we're going to be tracking together in the next 3 months? Let me start by telling you a little bit about what is the monitoring approach for this initiative, which was signed in Busan in 2011 by more than 160 countries and 54 international organizations, in addition of civil society organizations, private sector representatives, parliamentarians, and local governments. The approach is based on 2 principles. One is that it's a process which happens at the monitoring process that happens at the country level, is led by developing countries, both in the data collection and in the validation process, and it requires the consultation and active participation of the development partners, including providers of development cooperation, CSOs, and private sector actors, but also other stakeholders like trade unions and representatives of the parliament in some cases, or some national governments. The second point I wanted to highlight is that it's grounded to the extent possible in existing national processes. We don't want to the extent possible, introduce an ad hoc process of monitoring, but rely on institutions, platforms of dialogue that exist at the country level that can be used to either have the conversations that are necessary to answer some of the questions in this monitoring framework, or to collect data that can be, in many cases, retrieved from the aid management systems in countries. In some other cases in which this information is not readily available, both in the monitoring guide and in the support we're going to be providing through the process, there is an approach that can be followed to collect this information from government sources or from providers' sources, depending on the nature of the indicator. One of the aspects that are sometimes not highlighted regarding this monitoring process is that it tries also to spark a multi-stakeholder dialogue at the country level. It's not just about collecting data, but it's also about generating opportunities for all the actors that are relevant for the new 2030 agenda to be sitting around the table and discussing how can they work together in a better way in order to increase the effectiveness of development cooperation. Just a note on what is our role as a OECD UNDP joint support team. We basically provide global coordination to this effort, which is led by countries, and help collect, aggregate this data at the global level and produce this progress report that can synthesize the findings at the country level, but also country pages, country profiles that can discuss what is the situation in each country. We do that through, as you have seen in the past few months, through monitoring tools and reports and handbooks and guide notes through a help desk, which is available for you at any time for any question you may have, and also in some cases also from support from UNDP country offices. The 10 indicators are a combination of a legacy indicators coming from the Paris Declaration. This is not an effort that happens this year, but it has been going on since 2005. And developing countries and development partners agree that there are a few issues still relevant in the current development effectiveness agenda, including predictability of aid, that the development cooperation flows are on budget, the use of country systems, the existence of a mutual accountability framework in which development cooperation happens and is reported to, but also this new agenda that was created in Busan that includes a focus on results, a better engagement with the private sector, a better environment for CSO's contribution to development, a focus on transparency, and also a focus on a gender perspective, in this case on budgeting. For most indicators, the baseline is 2010. That was the latest data collection effort that had a participation of 77 countries. For new indicators, the baseline is 2013, or for most 2015. There were in Busan some commitments agreed for 2015. As you see in this table, which is impossible to read, but just to give you a flavor, is in the guide and is in the website. It's a description of the 10 indicators. They reflect 10 commitments agreed in Busan, and that were considered by the international community as relevant to track over time. And as we will be discussing in this webinar, and also in the webinars to be happening within this week, all the 10 indicators. Indicator 1, which is we're going to be focusing today, is focusing on the degree in which development cooperation is focused on results that meet developing countries' priorities, and is measured by the extent of use of countries' results frameworks by development cooperation providers at the country level. Indicator 5 that we are going to be also discussing today, it's focused on to what extent development cooperation is predictable. Indicator 6 looks at the fact if aid is on budgets that are subject to the scrutiny of parliaments. And indicator 9b, in this case, is focused on to what extent development cooperation providers are using country systems defined as public financial management systems and procurement systems. Just a quick overview of what are the steps that we have been carried out so far and what is coming up. The timeline for this second monitoring round started in discussions in last June, and it was launched in September with the participation of 70 plus countries, that now it's close to 80. The data validation, collection and validation process started with trainings for national coordinators at the regional level in Bangkok in October 2015, and then we had other 3 regional workshops in Latin America, in Africa, and also in the Pacific Islands. And the key deadline to remember is that we expect all this data collection effort to be running from October to the end of March, and 31st of March is the moment in which we expect, or we have agreed to receive the final and validated data from developing country developing country governments submitted to the OECD UNDP Joint Support Team. Then we'll have together 2 months to process and validate with you the final version of the data, in case there are some issues that factual errors that you may want to revise. And through that process, we will be working together and also by ourselves in trying to aggregate this data and produce the progress report, but also helping you in distilling these findings at the country level and start having these country level discussions of what those findings mean and what the different actors think about the way forward in terms of improving the results of these indicators. By the end of this year, 2016, we're going to have this high-level meeting of the Global Partnership that is scheduled for late November in Nairobi, Kenya. All the ministers will meet there, but we expect that before that we have had an opportunity to have country-level discussions on the findings that can then feed to the global level discussion of how do we improve the effectiveness of development cooperation and development efforts beyond that discussion, but in relationship to this 2030 agenda, and how can we become more effective in regard of the traditional, but also the new forms of development finance that are going to be supporting, for example, the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Let's focus just quickly who is being engaged actually in this process. As I was mentioning, more than 80 countries in developing countries are engaged in this process through the appointment of national coordinators that are leading or coordinating the participation of the country in the respective countries, and they typically sit in ministries of planning or finance, sometimes development, sometimes foreign affairs, and they are in charge of liaising with other government institutions, but also with development partners and other actors in the country. This effort wouldn't be effective if it doesn't have a multi-stakeholder nature, and for that we need providers of development cooperation with country offices in that particular country to engage in this discussion with the national coordinator from government, in providing data that is related to these indicators, and in facilitating this engagement of other providers at the country level. In addition, some indicators require the participation of civil society organizations, private sector representatives, and other stakeholders that are listed here in this slide. It happens typically through the appointment of focal points that can represent these constituencies in a coordinated way. If the government decides to go through existing platforms of discussion with providers of development cooperation or CSOs, for example, that's also a valid approach. The point at the end is that whatever is the means, those actors are engaged in the process. And from both Paris and New York, this UNDP, OECD joint support team, we are supporting this process. We have also the support of regional colleagues from UNDP in regional centers, and in many countries also support of UNDP country offices. On a case-by-case basis, we are also supporting through UNDP colleagues particular targeted support for national coordinators to carry out their responsibilities related to this collection of indicators at the national level. Finally, just an overview of what is the data being reported. I discussed briefly the indicators before, the 10 indicators. In fact, only 8 of the 10 indicators are collected at the country level. 2 are collected using global sources of information. For example, the indicator 10 on aid and the Untitled aid, it's information collected here at the OECD because it's calculated at the global level. So there is no need to report at the country level, but the information will go back to countries to have this discussion in country. Just this slide is just to point out that different actors have different roles for different indicators, and it is summarize a little bit the participation of providers, CSOs, private sector representatives, trade unions, and others in these multi-stakeholder conversations, or in providing, in the case of providers, data on what are the level of commitments and disbursements in the country in terms of development flows. Some indicators, as you can see, are quantitative, and some indicators are qualitative. And finally, as I was mentioning, the engagement of the different actors is not equal, and some are contributing with inputs to the effort of the national coordinator in collecting this data, others with participation in conversations, but all of them have a role both in the kick-off meetings of these monitoring rounds at the country level, and also in getting the information at the end and discuss the findings before being submitted to the joint support team or UNDP or OECD. So there is a role for everybody to bring their views of the constituencies through the focal points into this conversation at the country level. Before continuing to go into the details of this indicator number 1, maybe we leave some space for potential questions you may have on what is the process of this monitoring round and the timeline, and questions you may have about your specific role. I know we have in this webinar today representatives of national coordinators, representatives of providers and CSOs. So maybe it's a good moment to stop before we continue and get some question. You have two ways to pose questions in this webinar. One is by raising your hand if you have microphone capabilities and you can speak, or by in this menu to the right side, I mean, or by typing your question in the question section in that menu in the right side of the screen. Well, there is okay. So if we don't have any question, we'll continue to this indicator one that focus on the ownership of development efforts and the focus on results. As you can see, the indicator was agreed as extent of use of country-owned resource frameworks by providers of development cooperation, and the target by 2015 is that all development cooperation providers are using these country-owned resource frameworks in preparing their interventions, in designing the way they're gonna carry out these interventions, and focusing on priorities that are important for the country. So they are aligned with the plans at the national level, led by the government. And just to give you a little bit of background on this indicator, that was a consistent request from the Paris Declaration, the Accra Action Agenda, and the Busan Partnership Agreement, so 2005, 2008, 2011, and it called for relying on these partner country resource frameworks and M&E systems in order to increase the focus on development results that meet developing countries' priorities. The Busan commitment that you can see in the second paragraph is quite specific on that, but I just wanted to highlight the second element of this commitment, which is not just focus on priorities that are set by the government or the country, developing country, but also try to minimize the use of additional frameworks and retaining from introducing or requesting the introduction of performance indicators that were not consistent with countries' national development strategies. There was an emphasis in not adding new layers of monitoring and evaluation systems into whatever are the priorities of developing countries to minimize that the burden of managing aid at the country level. Key concepts that have been defined in the literature and the definition of this indicator is, one is this concept of country resource frameworks, CRFs. It's basically the country's approach to results and the associated M&E systems that are expected to be tracking these results, focusing on the performance and achievement of these development results. The idea is that countries, it's quite broad, the definition, because in some countries, CRFs are really clear, agreed with development partners, and top-down. They are consistent in the terms of how to define national priorities. It goes to the sector level and then to the institution or ministry level, and they have clear indicators used for results in each level. In other cases, countries haven't or implemented this kind of CRFs so consistent, or they have different ways to plan for priorities. It can be that they have, in some cases, sector policies or strategies that are very well defined, or that national development plans are quite specific in terms of targets. It doesn't matter, it's ambiguous about how do we define CRF, but we expect that there is a system or a hierarchy or architecture of results frameworks that are led by the government and to which development partners contribute to strengthen or align to those results frameworks. Results indicators it's a concept that you all are familiar with. I just want to clarify that in this case we focus on outcome indicators, but results indicators can be output, outcome, or impact. If the projects that we're going to be reporting on in this indicator do not have outcome indicators, then you can use output indicators, but in general it's very difficult to align providers results frameworks for a project at the output level because it's very specific. So we are measuring actually the linkage to output outcome indicators that are relevant for the government that are included in sector policies and plans and strategies. How do we measure in this indicator this alignment, this use of country resource frameworks? Basically, we ask you to go, providers of development cooperation, we ask you to go, you're going to receive from national coordinators a spreadsheet or a link to an electronic survey where you have to report on for 2015, only for that year, for new projects that were approved within 2015, so between January and December 2015, and in general that are above $1 million USD on 4 categories. One is at the level of objectives, another is at the level of results indicators, another is on what sources of evidence is required to measure those indicators mentioned in the point 2, and finally, if there is a final evaluation requested for the project in particular that you have approved in the country. It is not necessary, but it may be the case in some cases. And if so, if there is some government involvement expected in that final evaluation, either in defining the objectives of the evaluation and the scope, or in financing it. These 4 dimensions, as you'll see in the monitoring guide, you have to basically take your project document that has been approved in the project in 2015 and look at to what extent the objective of the project is aligned with some specific sector policy or plan or to the national development plan. And if there is a linkage, just mark yes and provide the evidence for, in the form maybe of a link, an electronic link to the national development plan or the sector policy you are mentioning, that you have a link between your project and the specific government planning document. Same for the other 3 dimensions. For results indicators, if your project has 3, 4, 5, 2, maybe 1 results indicator, outcome indicator, and that just mention the percentage of results indicators, outcome indicators in your project document that are drawn from government planning documents. And provide the evidence for it. Always provide the electronic link or the attached document to the government sector or national plan that include this outcome document as a priority, outcome indicator as a priority. For the other 2 dimensions, you'll see we're going to be asking for the same thing. If let's say a project had 3 outcome indicators that you have approved, and 2 of them are coming from government planning documents, they match, then mention if you plan in the document to measure and track the achievement of this indicator relying on government sources. And the last item is the final evaluation. Also just mention if there is a final evaluation planned within the project document, and if so, what is the level of government participation that is expected in the project, according to the project document. We will require or the link and the spreadsheet that the national coordinator is going to share with you, and you have to return to him, is going to require that you also include a link or attach the project document for the projects that you are reporting. In some cases, for small countries or countries where your portfolio is very small, you may not have any project that is above $1 million US. In those cases, we suggest that you have a conversation with the national coordinator and at least to report on one of the largest project you have in the country, approved in 2015. If you agree with the national coordinator that it will be more representative, if you contribute more than one project, which is maybe less than $1 million, then that's also welcome, because we need to get at the country level information which is representative to your portfolio in the country and the particular provider's portfolio in the country. The second section of this indicator, which I have to say is the most complicated of all the 10, so don't get scared. It's a brief country self-assessment. We are asking national coordinators to briefly, using some guiding questions we have in the guide and in the questionnaire they're receiving, a brief description no more than one page, of how priorities are set in the country and to what extent they are organized at the sector level, etc. It's going to be a context to understand and interpret in a better way, and to put into context these findings that are going to be generated by the first part, by the indicator 1A. Because in some countries there is a need still to improve the quality of planning and the quality of country results frameworks, and therefore there is it's a work in progress, and it should be actual knowledge to what extent there is progress in between the different parties to strengthen these planning tools at the country level. I went through this already. As I mentioned, national coordinators are going to identify a list of new projects that have been approved in 2015 in the country by the different providers and are above this 1 million threshold. And it's going to share with providers the spreadsheet or the survey link to report and to gather this data for those specific projects. Providers are expected to fill in then for these projects some descriptive information, what is the name, the size of the project, when was approved, etc. And then these 4 assessment fields, on if the project objective is aligned and with government planning tools, the percentage of resource indicators that are drawn from these planning tools, the percentage of resource indicators that rely on sources of data that come from the government, and finally, if there is an evaluation at the end, what level of participation of the government is expected. The national coordinators then gather this data from the different providers and are asked to report at the aggregate level. So basically, they follow the same 4 dimensions to report on this indicator, and they will say what is the share of interventions that have objectives and resource indicators that match government planning priorities, and also to what extent providers are using their existing data sources, monitoring systems, etc., to report on project progress, and finally, to what extent they are engaged in the phase of evaluations for the different projects. The second part of the indicator, as I mentioned, and is described in detail in page 44 of the guide. It will describe, is asking national coordinators to describe in a briefly way the characteristics of the country results framework or any alternative priorities in setting mechanism that exists in the country, and what is the level of development of these tools in the country so far. This will be the main points to discuss about indicator 1. I assume people may have questions on this indicator. We can stop for a minute here to report on, to answer questions you may have specific to this indicator. It's an indicator that engages providers and national coordinators in a very tight way to try to get this data together. So we may want to have a few minutes to discuss if you have any specific question. It's a new indicator.
No questions.
In any case, if any question comes up to your mind in the next hour as we go through your indicators, feel free to bring it up later, and we're going to have a break just for questions and answers after every indicator. So we'll move on. We'll move to indicator 5 that my colleague Nathan Werner is going to be covering.
Okay, so thank you, Alejandro. Yeah, my name is Nathan. I work as a statistician here for the Joint Support Team, and I'm going to cover indicators 5 and 6, and then pass it back to Alejandro, who will cover the last indicator for this clinic. So we're going to start with indicator 5, which is looking at specifically predictability of aid. One thing I wanted to mention first off is, in comparison to indicator 1 that Alejandro talked about, which in general looks at the project level for providers, this is kind of the aggregate level for providers. So basically, if you're involved in data submission or you're looking specifically at this indicator, you'll find that there is one record per provider for this indicator, as opposed to 1 record per project. Okay. So we're going to look specifically at annual and medium-term predictability for this indicator. 5A is going to look at annual predictability, so it's looking at what was dispersed within the calendar or fiscal year within the country in comparison to what was scheduled for disbursement by that provider. And then we're also going to look at coverage by forward expenditure plans by providers within the country. So these targets come from the 2010 or 2013 baseline, and they're formed as having the gap. So we'll see specifically what this means with some charts and coming up in a few slides. But you can see specifically what the targets are here for 2015 or for this upcoming survey. And again, we'll see in some charts. Okay, so kind of why is predictability important is kind of the underlying question for this indicator. Why do we care about it? The main objective now is that a country can have better ownership of funds that it's receiving and plan better to receive and allocate those funds. Okay? So again, 5A is going to look within the year. And in addition to the main objective that I just stated of having better ownership and being able to plan better for those funds, you can see that there's also other objectives of the indicator: greater transparency and accountability, and in general, better implementation of national development strategies, taking into account the funds that a country is expecting to receive. Okay, and the commitments that are underpinning this indicator come from both the Paris Declaration and reaffirmed in Busan, and also date back to Accra. Okay. Okay, so let's look first at annual predictability. So we're talking about the indicator 5 being broken down both into 5A and 5B, and now we're going to talk about indicator 5A, annual predictability. It should be noted that this is one of the indicators where the methodology is not changing for this monitoring round, and it also dates back to the Paris Declaration survey. So let's say it's one of the more established indicators in terms of methodology. And we can also form better trends with this indicator because it's been collected for a longer time. So as with most of the indicators, as Alejandro pointed out in terms of responsibility, it is the national coordinator that coordinates the data collection process for this indicator, seeking information, in this case, from providers. Okay? In terms of data submission, that can involve either an Excel spreadsheet or an online survey that looks specifically at these 4 questions. So we can also read these questions, but an overview is basically this question number QP11, the P meaning that it comes from the information comes from providers, is looking at the total amount of development cooperation funding that was dispersed by that provider in the country in the reporting year of reference. Okay? Then it's going to get more specific and look at the amount of funding that was specific for the government sector. And this is the quantity that will actually be used in the indicator, is the amount that goes to the government sector. And instead of just disbursements, we're also going to take into account what was scheduled. And it is the ratio of these two, what was actually dispersed and what was originally scheduled, that is the actual indicator. Okay? So you can think that if a provider dispersed more than what was originally scheduled, the indicator will take a value of greater than 100%, whereas if a provider dispersed less than what was originally scheduled, the indicator will take a value of less than 100%. Then we also have this additional question that is for reference purposes and for refining indicators in the future that asks how much was dispersed through other providers. So kind of channeled funding, okay? So from the first monitoring round, from the last report, this indicator was collected, and we can see that 84% of scheduled development cooperation funding for the government sector was spent according to schedule. Okay, so this is a positive trend from the previous survey, from the 2010 survey on monitoring the Paris Declaration, where we had 79% for this indicator, but it still hasn't reached the target, which is 90%. So an important thing to note is you can look at this 84%, and it also looks quite good, but it's also hiding discrepancies among countries themselves for the indicator. So if we look at kind of how countries report on this indicator and the distribution, you can see that on this left-hand side we have providers. We have countries for which the aggregate across all providers is the disbursements are less than what was originally scheduled. So I hope I'm explaining myself well on that. What we have disbursements less than scheduled for at the aggregate level for these reporting countries, and on the right-hand side here for reporting countries, we have at the aggregate level we have disbursements that are greater than what was originally scheduled. Now both of these can be problematic from the point of view from a country. Here they're getting less than what was expected, so they plan to receive more, and now they're not getting as much, and they're not able to fund the programs that they had originally allocated for. On the other hand, this can also be considered the less of the two evils, let's say, but it's also problematic in the sense that a country receiving more funds than what it originally expected could be problematic because it hasn't had a chance to allocate these funds in terms of programming. I don't know if you have anything to add at this point.
I agree with you. For most developing countries, is the first part in the left side is the problematic one.
Yeah.
But both are difficult for planning purposes. Yeah, and this is always within one single year. We are not looking at even further in time.
Right, yeah, so within the reporting year, how is this happening? And now we're going to actually look ahead in time. So now we're talking about not annual predictability, but what we refer to as medium-term predictability, and that's this indicator 5B. So now we're going to look at whether the providers have made available a comprehensive forward expenditure and or implementation plan for 1, 2, and 3 years ahead. And reporting for this indicator takes the form of a yes/no response for each of these fiscal years. And to qualify as a yes, there are these 3 criteria that should be met. First, the provider should be made available in written or electronic form. So there shouldn't be like a verbal indication wouldn't qualify for a forward expenditure plan. It should also set out indicative information on forward spending or implementation activities in the country, and it should present amounts by year, possibly also in greater detail, using the developing country's fiscal year. Okay. And then once aggregation happens, the indicator will take a value between 0 and 100%. And we can also look at the breakdown based on the highlights from the last monitoring round of the presence of these forward expenditure plans by 1, 2, or 3 years ahead. Okay. So we can look from the last monitoring round that 83% of total funding was covered by forward expenditure plans, and that's this value here, and this is what's remaining to reach the target. Okay. So how are these targets formed? We talked about having the gap, right? So if 83% was the original value, so the gap between the original value and 100%, if we have that distance, that's how these targets are formed. So that goes for 1, 2, and 3 years ahead. If we look at the proportion of total funding covered by forward expenditure plan 2 years ahead, we look at that gap and we have the distance. That's where these targets come from. Okay. So you can also see this characteristic of what happens in general as you look farther ahead in the future. There's this decreasing trend in that less funding is covered by forward expenditure plans as you go out farther in the future. And we can also look at there's more to do to reach the targets for further years ahead. Okay? For 5B. So I guess we have a question. We can, I guess we're done with 5B, so it's probably, we're done with the indicator on predictability, so it's probably a good time to look at questions.
So the first question we have is from Cesar Gonzalez from UNDP. His question is about contributions which are made in currencies that are not US dollars, for example, euros. Which exchange rate do you suggest that we use?
Okay. Is that the only one?
No, there's more.
Should I go one by one?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll handle that. So we've made an exchange rate table available on our Teamworks website that is part of the UN, that it's part of this UN Teamwork system, and we've made this exchange table available to convert local currencies to USD. We're asking countries to report all amounts in USD. These exchange rates were taken from the IMF, so International Monetary Fund.
The table allows you to make the conversions in an easy way, taking into account inflation and exchange rate. So we hope that that table helps you to do these calculations. It's available, as Nathan was saying, in our website, the community space that we have created, and you'll find the link in all the communications that we have been sending around in the last few months.
Okay, we'll move on to the next question, which comes from Miburo Sidiaki. His question is in French. I'll make it in English. In his country, it's almost impossible to have data about 2015. So it's impossible to document indicator 1A. So he's wondering whether they can do this exercise with data from 2014.
Okay, I'll take this question. I would like to emphasize that for indicator 1, we are asking 2015, and this is a question that has been raised several times, because countries wanted to the different actors to report in the latest behavior. In this case, we are not looking to disbursements or to approve amounts, but we are looking at the project documents that have been approved. So is the question that the indicators tend to answer is how projects are designed. Are designed in a way that are aligned with government priorities on plans, and they are designed in a way that rely on existing systems for monitoring and evaluation. So the projects, sometimes it takes a long time until they become effective and start disbursing. But you are looking only to the project document as it was approved by the development cooperation provider. So that's probably a date that appears in the project document as approved, and therefore you can correct me, and I seek your feedback now, but the information should be available for the projects that have been already approved in 2015. As I was mentioning again, in comparison to other indicators, this indicator 1 only focuses on how projects are designed. So the reference is always the project document as it was approved. It may be still in the process of starting execution, but we are still looking only to the design of the project. So it could be the only caveat to take into account.
Okay, there's a follow-up on the same question. So for indicator 1, could it be projects over 1 million from 2014 if there's no data from 2015?
So if in the cases, you have two options here for a development cooperation provider that hasn't approved anything in 2015, or which is suggested is that if you have a project that is even below 1 million in that year, 2015, you report on that year. So all the data reported by all the development cooperation providers is consistent, is reporting on the same year. No? If you only had projects in 2014, then have a conversation with the national coordinator what would be relevant to this to report on for this indicator 1. in the end, this is a country-led project, process, and the information should be relevant for the national coordinators for the government and for the discussion at the country level, and to extent possible to also be reported at the global level. But as I was saying, check with national coordinator, and maybe you can lower for your case the threshold of 1 million in order to have 2015 projects reported.
Okay, there's one more question from Lucia Desigis regarding predictability. So her question is, what is the added value on predictability indicator on a 1-year cycle? The question is because she's saying that delays in implementation effectiveness are usually calculated on a longer time frame. She's saying in development cycles, not humanitarian, 1 year corresponds to an annual work plan on commitments that are made on a longer time frame. So wouldn't it be better to request the provider strategy predictability, considering that providers usually have a strategy of implementation on the longer term?
May I answer?
Yeah.
It's true that this indicator 5P, as you saw, it's focusing this long-term perspective. Like, are national governments receiving good information on the planning of providers for the next 3 years, so they can also carry out planning at the national level, which is consistent with those disbursements that are going to be coming in different areas, agreed, between the different actors. But still, at the annual level, is relevant this observation and this indicator, because if we are not even able within 1 year to commit to deliver what we plan in January or whenever the fiscal year is starting, we have an issue of volatility. It's difficult to plan for national coordinators the single year, because they are not receiving what they expected, or they are receiving much more funding, which is not humanitarian, as you rightly pointed out, beyond what was expected. So it creates complications for the budgeting process within 1 year. And the agreement that was agreed since Paris, actually in 2005, is to in this graph that you see, to arrive to this one, to be consistent with your plan with what you approve, when you end disbursing within the year.
Okay, we have one more question from Rachel Serera. The question is regarding question P14. So she would like clarification in the case of multilateral agencies. So when the reporting agency is a multilateral organization and they are disbursing funds through bilateral partners, do bilateral partners qualify as other providers to be reported under this question?
There is I think it's pages 35 and 36 in the guide. They describe how to do the situations in which there is a risk of double accounting, because you as a multilateral agency can be reporting the same disbursements that the bilateral agency is reporting, and it's basically you have delegated into that bilateral agency the disbursements. So what is the rule for reporting is that the latest agency report making the disbursement is the one that reports on that disbursement. And funds that are channeled to the country through another development partner and disbursed by this other development partner shouldn't be reported in these disbursements.
So, just to clarify one more time. So if you're a multilateral, you should report on any funds that you did not channel through other providers, right? And in question 14, you should give an indication of those funds that you did channel through other providers only for this question. So I don't know if that's clear. Like for question 11, 12, and 13, for a multilateral, I should report on any funds that I did not channel, and for 14, just those funds that I did channel. Now, for those funds that were channeled, they should be reported according to the final provider that dispersed them, if I'm clear on that. So, in other words, if I'm a multilateral, I should report on funds that I did not channel. The ones that were channeled should be reported according to the last link in the channel, if that's clear.
Feel free to follow up with questions if our explanations weren't clear enough to any of these. different answers we provide.
So we have one hand raised from Simin Shin. I'll try to unmute. Simin, you should be unmuted.
Okay, Sabine, you feel free to speak. I don't think we can hear you. As an alternative, maybe feel free.
Unmute, right?
Click here, it says mute.
Click it again.
Simin?
If not, Simin, feel free to type your question in.
I can hear you, yeah.
Hi, actually, hi, I wanted to ask you a question regarding the indicator one. I'm sorry if I raised my hands in a not correct moment.
No problem. What is the question on indicator one?
Hi, the internet connection is not really good here.
Simin, we're having trouble hearing you. There is a lot of echo. Maybe you can type it out and we answer your question this way. So we wait a second. The question was on indicator one.
She will write the question later. So maybe
Okay, so she'll write the question later. So we move then to indicator 6.
Okay, so we've now talked about these issues for indicator 1 and also for indicator 5, where we talked about predictability, and now we're going to talk about another indicator. The number for this indicator is 6, so we're talking about indicator 6, and we're going to now talk about aid on budget. So specifically, what we're talking about is the percentage of development cooperation funding scheduled for disbursement that is recorded in the annual budget reported by the legislature of the developing country. And the goal for 2015 for this indicator is also set in terms of having the gap, which I tried to show kind of graphically for for indicator 5B. So taking the distance between the indicator of 100% and having that distance. So we're trying to reach 85% of development cooperation funding reported on developing country budgets. So here's a couple of just definitional concepts that are important for this indicator. So the annual budget, we're talking about what was originally approved by the legislature. We're not taking into account any subsequent revisions because, for one, we're worried about the credibility of the original approved budget, and revisions to these budgets are in many cases retroactive. In terms of what we mean by development cooperation funding, we're focusing on what are on the government sector. Okay. So this includes works, goods, or services delegated to subcontracted entities. So NGOs, semi-autonomous government agencies, and private companies. Okay. So kind of similarly for indicator 5, what's the main objective of this indicator? Why is aid on budget important? Okay, the main ideas are to incentivize better ownership, alignment, and accountability for the government to have a better knowledge of aid flows within the country, a better alignment with priorities as outlined in the budget of the government, more accurate and comprehensive budget reports, greater transparency by providers in reporting, and the possibility for parliaments to examine aid modalities, activities, and achievements. As for Indicator 5, the commitments are rooted in Accra and are also reaffirmed in Busan. So again, this is another one of those indicators that similarly as to Indicator 5, its methodology has not changed from the previous monitoring round. It's the same. And it also has a history going back to the surveys for monitoring the commitments to the Paris Declaration in 2005, 7, and 10. Okay, so specifically for this indicator, we're asking for the national coordinator to report on the following question. How much development cooperation funding was recorded in the annual budget of the reporting year of reference as grants, revenue, or loans, concessional and non-concessional, in USD? So maybe I can just say briefly what concessional and non-concessional funding is. Concessional funding is those funds that are received at better than market rates, and non-concessional funding are those development cooperation funds that are received at or close to market rates. And for a more precise definition of the two, you can look in the monitoring guide, because there are some borderline cases where it can be difficult to tell the difference. But let's say it's not distinguishing the two is not super important, because we're asking you to report on both for this indicator. Okay, so that's the only question that is specifically new to this indicator in terms of reporting. And then we're going to use the response from a previous indicator, Indicator 5A, in order to actually form Indicator 6. So we're going to take what was scheduled for disbursement by providers, and we're going to take the ratio of what the government included in the budget over what the provider had scheduled for disbursement to make Indicator 6, the proportion of funding that is included in budgets. So one thing that came up in the workshop that we held in Addis in Ethiopia for this indicator, specific to this indicator, was why are we looking at scheduled disbursements? Why are we not looking at what was actually dispersed? Okay, so I would ask the audience if they would want to respond, but maybe it's better because of the complexity of asking the question over the internet like this. I can say basically you want to take into account scheduled disbursements because that's what you're using when you make the budget, right? You don't have the information on what is going to be actually dispersed later. You only have what the provider is intending to do, hopefully, when you're making your budget. And so this is why, let's say that actual disbursements in the end differ than what was actually scheduled. Well, you didn't know that when you made the budget, so it shouldn't be taken into account for the indicator for what aid is on budget. I hope I'm clear on that. Okay? So we can look at kind of what was reported for the first monitoring round, also for Indicator 6. We had that 64% of all development cooperation funding for the government sector was included in national budgets. This was an improvement from the previous survey for monitoring the Paris Declaration of 57%, but is still far from the target. So as with Indicator 5A, it's also important to look at the distribution across countries, because you can have both of these cases happening. You can have the government having less on budget than what was scheduled for disbursement, and in some cases you can actually have more on budget than what was originally scheduled by the provider. So this was an interesting case, and we actually had some discussion at one of the workshops in Africa about kind of how this case on the right-hand side can happen. How can it happen that a government has more on budget than what the provider had scheduled? And so some things, I don't know, one idea was it can just be a problem with budgeting, that for whatever reason the government didn't have so either transparency in the sense that they get the wrong information from the provider, or possibly a mistake in budgeting, let's say, where for whatever reason a mistake was made and more was put on budget than the information that they had. So it can happen, let's say, in a couple different ways of this right-hand side. But let's say the majority of countries kind of fall into this left-hand side, where you have less on budget than what was scheduled for disbursement by providers. Okay. So I don't know if we want to. So I guess we don't have any questions at this point. I don't know if we want to stop for a minute or just jump into indicator 9b, the use of country systems.
Yes, we have a question. Yeah. So we have a question from Semin Chim, who typed her question. Can you please clarify on the definition to use for country results framework? Is it the national development strategy or some other subnational strategy?
This is an important question. When the indicator was conceptualized in 2011-12, in the work that followed Busan by a working group, there wasn't a discussion on what is a country results framework. And the fact is that countries organize their planning process in many different ways. In some cases, there is a country results framework that is agreed by the government with the support of the development partners and the strategy of what they align into. Sometimes this happens at the sector level. Sometimes there is not such a thing, and still the government has national development plans, sector policies and plans, and even at the institutional level, institutional development plans. That those things are also important when you think on where a small technical cooperation is going to be aligned to. No, if a technical cooperation focus on, for example, on training, it can be aligned to the institutional development plan of a ministry, which involves training as well. No, so the short answer is whatever planning document which is prepared by the government, is owned by the government, it's possible to establish an alignment to that one. So if a project has alignments to a sector plan, that's also fine. If it's to the national development plan, that's also good. Actually, in the reporting, you'll see you have the option to indicate if it was a sector plan or the national strategy, etc. So you have the chance to provide this detail on to what level of planning is the project aligned to. We as and this was consistent with these conversations in the different workshops with national coordinators and also with results specialists. We don't come with a predefined definition of what a good country results framework is. In each country is going to be looking in a different way, and in some countries it doesn't exist, but still providers can align in different ways to different sector level or national level plans and strategies.
So as a follow-up question, what if there is a planning document used by government but not shared with providers?
If the information is not available or accessible to providers, let's say it's a sector plan that is only was confidential, well, it's impossible for providers to align to it if they don't have a knowledge about it. I don't know if I understood correctly the question. The commitment in Busan, and let me go really quickly to it, it's to align to transparent country-led results frameworks. See, if the results framework is not, or the planning tool is not transparent in the sense that it's not public or accessible for development partners, then it's logical that they cannot align to it. But then they should indicate to what other planning tool or government-led results framework they are aligning to.
Okay, yeah, no more questions.
Okay, so we are in our last indicator. It has been an hour now. So let me go really briefly through this indicator 9b. let me go first to this distinction we want to make between 9A and 9B. Indicator 9 focuses on the strengthening and use of country systems. And the first part, indicator 9A, is tracking what is the quality of public financial management and procurement systems in a given country. And to date, it has been relying on this indicator created by the World Bank, the Country Policy and Institutional Assessment, CPIA, which offers a measure of what is the quality of developing countries' budget and financial systems. But I just want to mention that our colleagues from the Effective Institutions platform is working in a better indicator for the future, which combines other types of assessments that are more in line with what the different partners and countries are thinking is the way to measure the strength of country systems. This indicator 9A gives you a context also, like in 1A, 1B before. 9A gives you a context of what is the situation in the country regarding the quality of country systems. The focus of the measurement at the country level is on 9B, which is, as mentioned here, tracks the use of developing country PFM and procurement systems by development cooperation providers in disbursing, in transferring these resources to the country. The targets were set for 2015 in a different way, distinguishing those countries that already have good country systems, so they score high in the CPIA, and for them it's expected that there is a reduction in the gap of 2/3 when the quality of the PFM systems is equal or above 5, and for those countries that still have country systems that are in progress of strengthening, the gap was expected to be reduced by 1/3 by 2015. So let me go to two concepts that are going to be fundamental to understand this indicator. One is what are country systems, national systems for the management of funds. So those are the systems that are established in the national legislation, and typically is the national norms and procedures for budget execution, for financial reporting, for auditing, and for procurement processes. Those are the national systems, vis-a-vis the policies that providers may have for reporting, for procurement, etc. The objective of the indicator is track to what extent providers of development cooperation are using those national procedures instead of their own institutional procedures. So national coordination. Governments in developing countries are not facing 11 or 12 different procurement policies, for example, every year in implementing their projects. And the way we measure use, you'll see, is using those four dimensions. We don't assume that there is any particular modality of aid modality that is more aligned with use. In some cases, have been discussed that budget support is better aligned to use of country systems than project support. But in fact, project support can also be carried out through national systems or country systems. You'll see then that the objective of the indicator is to measure the extent of use of these systems by providers of development cooperation. The incentives that this indicator or reporting data at the country level and at the global level on this indicator tries, the incentive is to try to generate support for strengthening country systems when they are not being used, and also to increase accountability of the different countries versus citizens and parliaments regarding the use of development cooperation funding. And the European commitment agreed in Busan is to use country systems as a default approach for development cooperation in support of activities managed by the public sector. And that was there was an effort to reaffirm commitments that were agreed as before in Paris and in Accra. This indicator has been collected in the past, and this hasn't changed the way we collect this indicator since the Paris Declaration and in the last monitoring round. And as you can see here in the slide, is a national coordinator who is leading the collection of this information, and it checks with providers to get these inputs for the collection of this indicator through the link or through the spreadsheet, depending on what the national coordinator prefers to use to ask for inputs from your side, from the side of development cooperation providers. Using the reporting year reference that national coordinators set, so typically it would be maybe 2015 or 2014, depending on what year they are using, it has to be reported how much development cooperation funding has been disbursed to the government sector using national budget execution procedures, national financial reporting procedures, auditing procedures, and procurement systems. And the information should be reported in amounts of the US dollars. Using the guide that there is a set of criteria that can help determine providers whether they are or not using PFM and procurement systems. And as you will see here, at the end of the indicator is reporting on the average for the use of the different items that we have described, budget execution systems, financial reporting procedures, or auditing procedures, and procurement systems, out of the total that they have disbursed to the government sector. That part is coming from indicator 5A, so it's an information that is going to be there as well already. These are some, just to finish, some highlights from the previous monitoring round. What we found back then is that on average, 49% of disbursements for the government sector were using country systems, with the most used component being budget execution procedures. The aggregated data didn't show change in many countries. Actually, no change in 38 countries vis-a-vis the previous 2010 Paris survey, and it's still below the target of 57% of use set for 2015. We also found that although there is not a very strong correlation still between use and quality of country systems, there is a discussion at the international level of between the two parties, providers of their own cooperation and developing country governments. If I strengthen my systems, will you be using it, and vice versa? And there doesn't seem to be still a good correlation between the two actors.
Yeah, so just one possible reason of why it was hard to make this link is there may be a lag between quality and use, in the sense that if a country's PFN systems go up in quality, it may take some time for providers to kind of to see that the PFM system is better and to start using it. So that may be one reason why it's hard to make a strong correlation between the two.
That could be an explanation that can be reported. Actually, just before we close and we go to the questions, every indicator has a box for comments and observations where you can go a little bit beyond what is being asked and qualify your responses, or to give some feedback or context to the responses on the situation in the country that can be then help create a relevant reporting of what's going on in your particular country in terms of development effectiveness commitments. That could be it from our side. We have still some time for questions and answers, doubts you may have about the process or about any of the 4 indicators that we have been discussing, particularly maybe on this indicator number 9B that we just discussed a little bit about. Let's just wait a few seconds for participants so they have a chance to.
So the first question is from Diftufe Moreno. Is regarding how to address the issue of multiple PFM provisions in a developing country. So in Nigeria, for example, as a result of the federal nature of the country, there are different PFM provisions applied in the country. So how would you go about measuring this?
Okay, Nigeria is in an interesting case because the Nigerian government wanted to carry out in this monitoring round a pilot, not just to report data at the national level, but also report data for states at the subnational level. And in this case, the spreadsheet that providers of development cooperation are going to be receiving in Nigeria is going to be a bit different to the rest because they allow for reporting at the state level. In this case, you'll be able to report these differences and comment to what if you are aligned, if you are using subnational level country systems to disburse this aid.
We have another question from Alpina Kirjazi. So the question is, what happens in the case when a country is a middle-income country and the World Bank's CPIA is no longer measured? What type of information can the country use in this case?
That's a good point. The CPIA is measured for middle-income countries, but not disclosed because that's the agreement of the World Bank. IBRD versus IDA countries have different regulations, and one is that CPIA at the World Bank for middle-income countries is just reported for internal staff, but if the government agrees to disclose this information, it can be published, but it's a decision of the national coordinator to do so. If that's the case, then we will be able to report on that indicator for that particular country. If the government doesn't authorize, then we cannot report on that particular indicator using that measurement. In the report and in the country pages, we are trying to also bring other sources of evidence that can help you, national coordinator, the government providers at the country level to inform the discussion with as much evidence as possible, although, of course, the STEM indicators are the key information is going to be reported on. The other sources is just to complement and help you understand why the different actors are facing at the moment bottlenecks to implement this indicator, where success is to get credit and to report why this happened and change happened and it was successful. But again, it could be a moment, a discussion that we can have with the different national coordinators. So for middle-income countries, where in those cases where they don't report anymore, the information on CPIA has to have their clearance to be reported publicly.
Okay, we have one question from Alejandra Mejia from the Inter-American Development Bank. So as the Inter-American Development Bank, our role is to validate these indicators based on the information provided by the government or from focal point provider, or are we supposed to calculate any of these informations?
For this, but I wonder if the question is for 9A or 9B. The national coordinators are the ones that validate the information that is received from the different providers of development cooperation, and in the case of the IDB. So they may have information that we are asking for, and they are not going to reach you out, maybe consult you if you agree. But in general, they may also actually ask you for the inputs on use of country systems, for example. And this information, I'm aware, is available at the IDB. So they will get back this information if they request it, hopefully with your help, the help of the institution, and then report on it after they also validate it with you at the country level. We are asking to avoid inconsistencies in between what is reported at providers' headquarter level and the different country offices, that there is a conversation within providers themselves, within every agency, to consult before sending information to the national coordinator to make sure that the information that they are sending to national coordinators at the country level, the country office, is consistent within the institution. Last time we had, in the last monitoring round, for some agencies we had some disagreement in between what the country offices were reporting and what the headquarters level were reporting. And the only way to solve this is that before submitting information to the national coordinator, the information has been validated. It's owned by the agency.
Yeah, just to expand on that, basically his description holds also for the other indicators that we discussed today, though. For indicators 1, 5A, and 6, you will see that there is a role for providers to report information on those indicators to the national coordinator. I wanted to go to slide 7 to show how they should engage.
So we're going to be back.
Here. So here, if you're still looking at the presentation, you can kind of see what the role is of the different stakeholders to engage and kind of what the responsibilities are if they're participating. So that's what I was trying to say here, is that, yeah, they provide data for those indicators, and also contribute to data validation in the sense that if a national coordinator has a discrepancy with the information, they may get back to you and ask for clarification. And
yeah, and we expect also the national coordinators have been informed through the different regional workshops that it's good practice to have a closing meeting after all the data collection has happened to validate with the different stakeholders, particularly also providers that have inputted a lot of information to national coordinators on this regard, on what are the main findings of or the information reported on them. So before submitting to the OECD UNDP joint support team the information, it should be have this final review at the country level, so it's owned by all the stakeholders. It's not on the subsequent policy discussions or plans together to improve these indicators wouldn't have the same kind of level of ownership and support behind. So it's important that before submitting to us, the information has been validated at the country level. Do we have any other questions?
No. We don't seem to have any more questions.
Okay. In any case, we are available at the email monitoring@effectivecooperation.org. We really thank you all the participation we have received for this webinar. We hope it was useful. We'll try to be creating new opportunities for new webinars, for example, for our colleagues that are based in Asia and Pacific, and sometimes this time is not very good for them. And also provide you with other tools to go back to these indicators and understand. This week we have still 2 other webinars on the rest of indicators, and we hope you can attend. Thank you very much.
thank you.